The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of JFK International Airport as passengers hurried to their gates. Among them was Michelle Chen, clutching her designer handbag and dragging her expensive carry-on suitcase across the polished floor. Her heels clicked against the tiles as she made her way to Gate B23, where her first-class flight to Los Angeles awaited. Michelle was having what she considered a terrible day. Her morning meeting had run late, her favorite coffee shop had messed up her order, and now she was barely making her flight. At 42, she had worked her way up to become one of the top marketing executives at her firm, and she was used to things going her way. As she approached the gate, she noticed the first-class line was mercifully short. She proudly took her place, straightening her crisp blazer and checking her perfectly styled hair in her phone's reflection. The gate agent called for first-class boarding, and Michelle stepped forward, presenting her boarding pass with the practiced ease of a frequent flyer. Walking down the jet bridge, she mentally prepared herself for the 5-hour flight. She had important presentations to review, and she was looking forward to enjoying the peaceful luxury of first class. But as she stepped into the aircraft, something immediately caught her attention and made her perfectly plucked eyebrows furrow in annoyance. Sitting in seat 2A was a young black child, probably around 10 years old, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. He was absorbed in playing some game on a tablet, his small backpack stuffed under the seat in front of him. Michelle checked her boarding pass again, seat 2B, right next to the child. She stood in the aisle, making no attempt to hide her displeasure. The child looked up briefly, offered a polite smile, then returned to his game. Michelle noticed his sneakers weren't any designer brand she recognized, and his clothes looked like they came from a regular department store. "Excuse me," Michelle called out to the flight attendant, who was helping another passenger stow their luggage. Her voice carried through the cabin, deliberately loud enough for others to hear. "I think there might be some confusion. This section is first class." The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with a warm smile and professional demeanor, approached Michelle. "Yes, ma'am. Is there something I can help you with?" Michelle gestured toward the child with a slight tilt of her head. "I just want to make sure everything is in order. It seems unusual to have an unaccompanied minor in first class." She emphasized the words first class as if they were made of gold. The flight attendant glanced at the child, who was clearly trying to appear absorbed in his game, but whose shoulders had tensed noticeably. "Sir," she addressed him kindly, "may I see your boarding pass?" Without looking up, the boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a properly issued first-class boarding pass. The flight attendant examined it and nodded. "Everything appears to be in order, ma'am. Would you like help storing your luggage?" Michelle pressed her lips together, clearly not satisfied with this response. She made a show of struggling with her carry-on bag, muttering under her breath about standards these days and how some people must have gotten their seats upgraded. Other first-class passengers boarding after Michelle couldn't help but notice her behavior. An elderly gentleman shook his head disapprovingly as he passed. A young woman in a business suit shot Michelle a disgusted look. But Michelle remained oblivious to their reactions, too focused on her own discomfort. As she finally settled into her seat, Michelle pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. The child glanced at her once more, then shifted slightly closer to the window, trying to make himself as small as possible. His tablet screen showed an advanced mathematics game, though Michelle was too preoccupied with her own assumptions to notice. The boarding continued around them, with the usual shuffle of passengers finding their seats and stowing their bags. Michelle made several loud phone calls, speaking in an exaggerated voice about her important meetings in Los Angeles and how she always flies first class because you never know who you might meet. "Well, usually," she added with a pointed look at her seatmate. The flight attendant passed through the cabin, offering pre-flight beverages to the first-class passengers. When she reached their row, she addressed the boy first, treating him with the same respect she showed every other passenger. "Would you like something to drink before takeoff?" The child politely requested water, his voice soft but well-spoken. Michelle ordered a champagne, making another comment about needing it for this flight. The flight attendant maintained her professional demeanor, but there was a slight tightness around her eyes that suggested she wasn't pleased with Michelle's behavior. As the final boarding call was announced, Michelle noticed several other passengers in first class giving her strange looks. Some were whispering to each other, occasionally glancing in her direction. She interpreted their attention as agreement with her position, straightening her spine and giving them what she thought was a knowing look. The cabin crew began their final preparations for takeoff. The child had taken out a book from his backpack, an advanced physics text that would have been challenging for most adults, but Michelle was too busy sending last-minute emails to notice. The seat next to the boy, 2C, remained empty as the boarding door was about to close. Little did Michelle know, but her day was about to take an unexpected turn. The casual assumptions she had made, the subtle and not-so-subtle comments she had thrown around, were about to come back to haunt her in a way she never could have anticipated. As the final seconds of boarding ticked down, heavy footsteps could be heard coming down the jet bridge, footsteps that would lead to a moment of realization that would change Michelle's perspective forever. The flight attendant held the cabin door open for one last passenger, and the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was about to shift dramatically. Michelle, still absorbed in her phone, remained unaware that her comfortable world of assumptions and prejudices was about to be thoroughly shaken. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew tenser with each passing minute. Michelle couldn't seem to help herself as she continued making subtle yet pointed comments about the unexpected presence of her young seatmate. Her voice carried just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, but not quite loud enough to be considered outright confrontational. "I remember when first class meant something," she remarked to no one in particular, tapping away at her phone. "When there were certain standards, you know." She glanced meaningfully at the child beside her, who was doing his best to focus on his book. A businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The elderly couple in front turned around briefly, their faces showing clear disapproval. But Michelle seemed blind to the reactions her behavior was generating among her fellow passengers. The flight attendant, Lisa, passed through the cabin again, her professional smile masking her growing concern for the young passenger. She had seen situations like this before in her 15 years of flying, but it never got easier watching adults behave poorly. "Everything okay here?" Lisa asked, pausing at their row. Her question was directed primarily at the child, who gave a small nod without looking up. His fingers gripped his book a little tighter, the only visible sign of his discomfort. Michelle seized the opportunity. "Actually," she said, raising her voice slightly, "I was wondering about your unaccompanied minor policies. Surely there must be some mistake. Shouldn't he be seated with a flight attendant, or perhaps in economy?" She emphasized the last word with what she probably thought was subtle emphasis. Lisa's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Sir is properly ticketed for first class, ma'am. And I can assure you that all our policies are being followed correctly." Her tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for argument. But Michelle wasn't done. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to what she imagined was a conspiratorial whisper, though it was still clearly audible to those around her. "Look, I don't mean to make trouble, but how did he even get this seat? Did someone upgrade him? Because I pay full price for first class, and I think it's important to maintain certain standards." The child's shoulders hunched slightly, though he kept his eyes fixed on his book. A few rows back, a woman in a business suit had pulled out her phone and appeared to be recording the interaction discreetly. Lisa took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "Ma'am, I want to be very clear. Every passenger in this cabin has a valid first-class ticket. We do not discriminate based on age or any other factors. Now, can I get either of you anything before takeoff?" The boy quietly asked for another water, his voice steady despite the situation. Michelle waved Lisa away with a dismissive hand gesture, then pulled out her phone again. "Just wait until my social media followers hear about this," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The airline will be hearing from me about their policies." A young woman seated across the aisle couldn't contain herself any longer. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and confident, "but don't you think you're being a bit inappropriate? He's just a child trying to read his book." Michelle's head snapped up, her face flushing. "I'm simply expressing concern about airline policies," she defended herself. "As a frequent first-class passenger, I think I have the right." "To harass a child?" interrupted the elderly man in front, turning around in his seat. "Because that's what you're doing, whether you want to admit it or not." Michelle's face reddened further, but instead of taking the hint, she doubled down. Well, I just think there should be certain standards. When I was growing up, first class meant something. Now they're just letting anyone. Anyone what? Came a deep voice from the aisle. The entire first-class cabin fell silent. Standing there was a tall, distinguished-looking man in an impeccably tailored suit. His presence commanded attention, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. Michelle's words died in her throat as she looked up at him. The boy finally lifted his eyes from his book, and for the first time since boarding, a genuine smile spread across his face. The man's stern expression softened as he looked at the child, though it hardened again when he turned back to Michelle. The other passengers watched in absolute silence, sensing that a moment of reckoning had arrived. The woman who had been recording was still holding her phone, though she was trying to be discreet about it. Michelle's face had lost all its color. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. She suddenly seemed very interested in her phone, though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Lisa, the flight attendant, had returned to the front of the cabin. She stood watching the scene unfold with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction, though she maintained her professional demeanor. The distinguished man remained standing in the aisle, his presence impossible to ignore. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Michelle's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by a growing realization that she had made a terrible, terrible mistake. Other passengers in first class were now openly watching the situation unfold. Some wore expressions of satisfaction, clearly pleased to see Michelle's behavior being called into account. Others looked embarrassed on her behalf, though not necessarily sympathetic. The man still hadn't spoken again, but he didn't need to. His mere presence had completely altered the dynamic in the cabin. The boy had put his book down and was sitting up straighter, no longer trying to make himself invisible. Michelle's world had shrunk to the small space of her seat, where she sat rigid with embarrassment. All her previous complaints about standards and certain people seemed to echo in her mind, taking on a new and mortifying significance. The cabin crew had begun their final preparations for takeoff, but all eyes remained on the unfolding scene in row 2. What had started as one woman's misguided complaints had transformed into a moment of reckoning that no one present was likely to forget. The next few hours of the flight promised to be very interesting indeed, and Michelle was beginning to realize that her assumptions and prejudices were about to cost her far more than she could have imagined. The lesson she was about to learn would be one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The distinguished man in the aisle was Robert Thompson, though everyone in the business world knew him as the founder and CEO of Future Tech Solutions. His net worth of $3.2 billion made him one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country, but right now, he was simply a father whose child had been mistreated. I believe you were expressing some concerns about the standards of first class. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel that made Michelle sink further into her seat. I'd be very interested in hearing more about what standards my son doesn't meet. The other passengers watched in complete silence as Michelle's face cycled through various shades of red and white. Her earlier bravado had vanished entirely, replaced by the dawning horror of recognition. Robert Thompson's face had been on the cover of Fortune magazine just last month. I didn't, Michelle stammered, but no coherent words followed. Robert placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and sat down next to his son, smoothly adjusting his suit jacket. "How are you doing, buddy?" he asked softly, his tone completely different from the one he'd used with Michelle. "Sorry I cut that call so close." "I'm okay, Dad," the boy replied, visibly relaxing now that his father was beside him. "I was just reading about quantum mechanics." Robert smiled proudly, then turned his attention back to Michelle, who looked like she wanted to disappear into her seat. "You know," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet cabin, "my son could probably explain the physics behind how this plane stays in the air. He's presenting his research on quantum entanglement at a youth science symposium in LA." Several passengers nodded appreciatively. The elderly couple in front had turned around completely in their seats, no longer pretending not to watch. The woman who had been recording earlier had put her phone away, but was still paying close attention. I had no idea," Michelle managed to whisper. "Clearly," Robert replied. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You made quite a few assumptions in the last 30 minutes. Would you like to know what else you didn't know? Michelle shook her head slightly, but Robert continued anyway. My son has been flying first class since he was 3. He's probably spent more time in the air than most of the passengers in this cabin. He's also raised over $50,000 for children's education programs through his coding workshops. But you didn't bother to learn any of that, did you? The flight attendant, Lisa, approached with pre-flight drinks. Mr. Thompson, it's wonderful to see you again, she said warmly. Would you like your usual? Thank you, Lisa, and thanks for looking out for my son, Robert replied, accepting a sparkling water. I heard everything that happened before I boarded. Michelle's hand shook as she reached for her champagne, managing to spill a few drops on her expensive blouse. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Her designer clothes and apparent wealth hadn't made her look any more sophisticated than the child she tried to belittle. A soft chime sounded through the cabin, and the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their imminent departure. The normal bustle of final preparations continued, but the atmosphere in first class remained charged with tension. Robert pulled out his tablet and began reviewing some documents with his son, pointing out various technical details that went well over most passengers' heads. Their easy interaction and the boy's obvious intelligence made Michelle's earlier comments seem even more ridiculous. Other passengers were now openly giving Michelle disapproving looks. The young businesswoman who had spoken up earlier caught Robert's eye and gave him a supportive nod. The elderly couple whispered to each other, occasionally glancing back with expressions that mixed satisfaction with lingering disapproval of Michelle's behavior. As the plane began to taxi, Michelle tried to make herself as small as possible in her seat. Her phone, which she'd been so eager to use for complaints earlier, remained untouched in her lap. The social media followers she'd threatened to tell about the situation would have to wait for a very different story, if she dared to share it at all. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but few passengers in first class were paying attention. They were too busy watching the continuing drama unfold in row 2. Robert was now helping his son with what appeared to be complex mathematical equations that heads bent together over a notebook. Michelle's earlier comments about standards and certain people hung in the air like a bad smell. The contrast between her assumptions and reality couldn't have been more stark. Here was a child who not only belonged in first class, but was arguably more accomplished than many adults in the cabin. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Michelle closed her eyes, perhaps wishing she could wake up from what had become a nightmare of her own making. But this was no dream, and the consequences of her actions were only beginning to unfold. The 5-hour flight to Los Angeles stretched ahead of them, and it was clear that this story was far from over. Robert Thompson's arrival had changed everything, but it wasn't just about his wealth or status. It was about the harsh light he'd shown on the ugly assumptions that some people carry with them, even in the supposedly sophisticated world of first-class travel. The plane lifted off into the afternoon sky, carrying with it a cabin full of passengers who were about to witness an important lesson in humility, prejudice, and the dangers of judging books, or people, by their covers. For Michelle, it would be the longest and most enlightening flight of her life. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the reality of Michelle's situation continued to sink in. The distinguished businessman she had watched on countless news segments and business channels was sitting just 2 seats away, quietly helping his son with advanced mathematics problems. The same child she had spent the last half hour trying to shame out of first class. Every few minutes, she would sneak glances at them, her face burning with embarrassment. Robert caught her looking once and held her gaze steadily until she turned away, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her designer blazer. The flight attendant, Lisa, began the first-class meal service. "Mr. Thompson," she said warmly, "we have your usual vegetarian meal prepared. And for your son, we made sure to include the dairy-free option he prefers." "Thank you, Lisa," Robert replied. "You always take such good care of us." Michelle watched as Lisa's professional demeanor transformed into genuine warmth when interacting with the Thompsons. It was clear they were regular flyers who treated the crew with respect, something Michelle realized she hadn't done. When Lisa reached Michelle with the meal cart, her tone returned to polite professionalism. "Would you like the chicken or pasta today, ma'am?" Michelle barely managed to whisper pasta before turning to stare out the window, though she was seated in the middle and could barely see anything past Robert's stun. The boy was now explaining something about his science project to his father, his voice animated but kept low out of consideration for other passengers. "And then we demonstrated quantum entanglement using photon pairs," he said excitedly. "My teacher said it's beyond college level." Robert beamed with pride. "That's amazing, son. Your mother will be so excited to hear about this when we call her tonight." More passengers were stealing glances at their row now, but not because of Michel's earlier behavior. They were impressed by the young boy's intellectual discussion with his father. The elderly couple in front occasionally turned around to smile encouragingly at him. Michel picked at her pasta, her appetite gone. Her mind kept replaying her earlier comments about standards and certain people. Each word she had spoken felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. The irony was crushing. She had tried to suggest someone didn't belong in first class, and it turned out he was probably the most qualified person in the cabin. About halfway through the meal service, Robert finally addressed Michel directly. His voice was measured and calm, but it carried an authority that made everyone nearby pay attention. "You know," he said, "I've been in situations like this before. People see my son alone and make assumptions. They see his casual clothes and young age and decide he doesn't belong." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I've never heard someone be quite so vocal about their prejudices." Michel's fork clattered against her plate. A few passengers leaned in slightly, not wanting to miss what was happening. "I'm so sorry," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was completely out of line." "Yes, you were," Robert agreed. "But I'm not the one you should be apologizing to." Michel turned slightly toward the boy, who was watching the exchange with calm interest. This 10-year-old child, she realized, was handling the situation with more maturity than she had shown. "I'm very sorry," she said to him, her voice shaking. "What I said was wrong. I made terrible assumptions, and I behaved badly." The boy nodded solemnly. "Thank you for apologizing," he said simply, then returned to his book about quantum physics. The woman across the aisle who had spoken up earlier caught Michel's eye and gave her a small nod of approval. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was acknowledgement of a step in the right direction. Robert pulled out his tablet and began showing his son something about their upcoming schedule in Los Angeles. "After your science presentation," he was saying, "we have that meeting with the Children's Hospital Board about expanding the coding program." Michel couldn't help but listen as they discussed the charitable foundation the boy had started, teaching coding to kids in underprivileged communities. Each new detail made her earlier behavior seem more and more appalling. The flight attendant returned to clear their meals. As she reached for Michel's barely touched pasta, she gave her a look that wasn't unkind, but clearly communicated that she hadn't forgotten the earlier incident. The rest of the passengers had settled into their routines, some watching movies, others working on laptops, a few dozing off. But there was still an undercurrent of attention focused on row 2, where a powerful lesson in humility and prejudice was still unfolding. Michel tried to focus on some work documents, but the words blurred before her eyes. Her perfectly planned business trip had transformed into something else entirely, a harsh mirror showing her a side of herself she hadn't wanted to see. As the plane continued its journey westward, the sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate more than just the cabin. It shone a light on assumptions, on privilege, on the quick judgments people make without knowing the full story. For Michel, it was becoming the most expensive lesson she'd ever learned, and it hadn't cost her a single dollar, just her pride and her comfortable illusions about herself. The flight was only halfway done, but Michel already knew this was a day she would never forget. The question was, what would she do with this lesson once she stepped off the plane? The flight continued westward, with 2 hours still remaining until Los Angeles. Michel sat uncomfortably in her seat, watching the interaction between father and son that made her earlier behavior seem even more shameful. Robert had pulled out a laptop and was reviewing his son's presentation for the upcoming science symposium. "Let's go through your slides one more time," he said gently. "Remember, when you're explaining quantum entanglement, start with the basics for those who might not be familiar with the concept." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "Like Einstein's spooky action at a distance?" he asked, causing several nearby passengers to look up in surprise at hearing such advanced concepts from someone so young. "Exactly," Robert smiled. "Begin with that, then build up to your experimental results." Michelle couldn't help but listen, each word a reminder of how terribly wrong her assumptions had been. The child she had tried to shame out of first class was preparing to present research that she could barely understand. Lisa, the flight attendant, passed through the cabin with a fresh round of drinks. She paused at their row, offering water to Robert and his son. When she turned to Michelle, her professional smile remained, but there was a knowing look in her eyes that made Michelle shrink further into her seat. The elderly couple in front had given up pretending not to be interested. The woman frequently turned around, offering encouraging smiles to the young scientist. Her husband had even asked a few questions about the quantum physics project, genuinely fascinated by the boy's explanations. "You know," the elderly man said, "I was a physics teacher for 40 years, and I'm impressed by your understanding of these concepts. You have a bright future ahead of you, young man." The boy thanked him politely, then turned to his father. "Dad, can we review the coding workshop schedule for next month? I want to make sure we can accommodate all the new students." Robert pulled up another document on his tablet. Michelle glimpsed a spreadsheet showing dozens of names and class times. She learned that the boy had been teaching coding to underprivileged children, using his knowledge to help others learn valuable skills. The young businesswoman across the aisle had been listening to. "That's amazing," she said. "How many students do you teach?" "We started with 10 kids last year," the boy explained, his face lighting up. "Now we have over 100, and there's a waiting list. We're trying to find more volunteer teachers to help expand the program." Michelle's earlier comments about standards echoed mockingly in her head. This child wasn't just worthy of being in first class. He was doing more to help others than most adults she knew, including herself. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin, Robert and his son moved on to discussing the boy's upcoming meeting with hospital administrators. They were planning to implement his coding program in the children's ward, giving long-term patients a chance to learn valuable skills during their hospital stays. The other passengers had settled into a quiet rhythm of work and rest, but the atmosphere around row 2 remained charged with unspoken lessons. Michelle tried to focus on her laptop, but she kept finding herself listening to the conversations beside her, each one revealing another layer of depth to the child she had so quickly judged. Lisa returned with another round of snacks. "Here's your favorite," she said to the boy, handing him a special dairy-free option they kept stocked just for him. The care and consideration shown by the crew was yet another indication of how regularly and respectfully the Thompsons traveled. Michelle noticed small details she had missed earlier. The way the boy always said please and thank you, how he kept his voice down to avoid disturbing others, his thoughtful questions about Lisa's family. He showed better manners and more consideration than many adult passengers she'd encountered in first class. The elderly couple's granddaughter, it turned out, was one of the students in the coding workshop. They had been hoping to meet the young teacher who had inspired her to pursue computer science. The coincidence led to a warm conversation about the importance of mentorship and education. As the plane began its gradual descent toward Los Angeles, Michelle found herself reflecting on the events of the flight. She had boarded the plane feeling superior, entitled, and certain of her place in the world. Now those certainties had crumbled, replaced by uncomfortable truths about her own prejudices. The sunlight streaming through the windows painted the cabin in warm golden hues, but Michelle felt no warmth. Instead, she felt exposed, as if the light was illuminating every flaw in her character, every baseless assumption she had made. Robert and his son were now quietly reviewing some final details for their upcoming meetings. That easy rapport, mutual respect, and shared commitment to helping others stood in stark contrast to the ugly behavior Michelle had displayed earlier. The flight was nearing its end, but Michelle knew that the impact of this journey would stay with her long after she stepped off the plane. She had witnessed not just a lesson in humility, but a demonstration of how wrong first impressions could be and how much damage quick judgments could cause. As the captain announced their final approach to Los Angeles, Michelle closed her eyes, wishing she could start the day over. But life doesn't offer do-overs, it only offers chances to learn and change. The question was, would she take this opportunity to become a better person, or would she try to forget this uncomfortable lesson as quickly as possible? The answer to that question would determine whether this flight remained just a shameful memory or became the catalyst for real change in her life. As the plane touched down at Lex, Michelle was already gathering her belongings, eager to escape the scene of her humiliation. But fate had other plans. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, asking first-class passengers to remain seated momentarily due to some congestion at the gate. Robert Thompson chose this moment to finally address the situation head-on. Turning slightly in his seat, he faced Michelle with a calm but serious expression. "Before we all go our separate ways," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clear authority, "I think we should talk about what happened today." Michelle froze, her hands still on her designer handbag. Around them, other passengers tried to pretend they weren't listening, but their attention was obvious. Even Lisa, the flight attendant, slowed her final cabin check to stay within earshot. "I'm not here to shame you," Robert continued, his tone measured. "But I want you to understand something. My son has experienced moments like this before. People making assumptions, questioning his presence, doubting his abilities. Each time, it leaves a mark." The boy looked up from his book, his face showing a maturity beyond his years. Michelle couldn't meet his eyes, her own gaze fixed on her lap. "What you may not realize," Robert went on, "is that these moments don't just affect him. They affect every child who faces similar prejudice. Every young person who gets told they don't belong somewhere because of how they look, what they wear, or who they are." The elderly couple in front had turned around completely now, no longer pretending not to listen. The businesswoman across the aisle had put away her laptop, giving the conversation her full attention. "Today, you questioned his right to be in first class," Robert said. "Tomorrow, someone else might question his right to be in an advanced class, or at a prestigious university, or in a boardroom. These assumptions build walls that shouldn't exist." Michelle finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "I never meant. I didn't think." "That's exactly the problem," Robert interrupted gently. "You didn't think. You saw what you wanted to see and made judgments based on your own biases." The plane had come to a complete stop now, but nobody in first class made a move to leave. The moment felt too important to interrupt. "But here's what you didn't see," Robert continued. "You didn't see the hours he spends studying advanced mathematics and physics. You didn't see him teaching coding to other kids who society might write off too quickly. You didn't see him raising money for educational programs in underserved communities." Lisa stood nearby, nodding slightly as Robert spoke. She had witnessed similar scenes before, but never one handled with such grace and purpose. "Most importantly," Robert said, "you didn't see him as a person. You saw a stereotype, a preconception, an assumption. And that's what needs to change, not just in you, but in society as a whole." The boy touched his father's arm gently. "Dad, it's okay," she apologized. Robert smiled at his son, pride evident in his expression. "Yes, she did. And that's a start. But apologies need to be followed by action, by change, by doing better." Michelle felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "I was completely wrong. Not just about your son, but about everything. The way I think, the way I judge, it all needs to change." "That's good to hear," Robert replied. "Because change is possible. Every person who realizes their mistakes and commits to doing better helps create a world with fewer barriers, fewer prejudices, and more opportunities for everyone." The captain announced that they could now deplane. As passengers began gathering their belongings, there was a thoughtful silence in the first-class cabin. Everyone had witnessed something significant, not just a confrontation, but a moment of potential transformation. As they stood to leave, Robert had one final thing to say. "My son and I will be speaking at a conference next month about breaking down barriers in education and technology. You're welcome to attend if you're serious about making changes." He handed Michelle a business card. She took it with slightly trembling hands, recognizing this gesture for what it was, not just an invitation, but an opportunity for redemption. The other passengers began filing out of the cabin, many of them nodding respectfully to Robert and his son. The elderly couple paused to shake their hands, and the businesswoman across the aisle exchanged contact information, interested in supporting their coding program. As Michelle finally stepped off the plane, she clutched the business card like a lifeline. The Los Angeles sun was bright and unforgiving, much like the light that had been shed on her own prejudices during the flight. But within that harsh illumination, she had been offered a path forward, a chance to learn, to grow, and to become part of the solution rather than the problem. The day had not gone as she had planned, but perhaps it had gone exactly as it needed to. Sometimes the most important lessons come wrapped in the most uncomfortable packages, and the most valuable changes begin with the most painful realizations. 3 months after that fateful flight, Michelle stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her blazer nervously. The conference invitation card from Robert Thompson lay on her counter, marked with today's date. After weeks of self-reflection and soul-searching, she had decided to attend. The venue was packed when she arrived. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium, many of them young students from diverse backgrounds. Michelle found a seat near the middle, her heart beating faster when she recognized Robert and his son walking onto the stage. "Today, we're not just talking about technology," Robert began, his voice carrying through the hall. "We're talking about breaking down barriers, about challenging assumptions, and about creating opportunities for everyone, regardless of how they look or where they come from." Michelle watched as Robert's son stepped up to the podium, looking confident in a neat suit that matched his father's. He began presenting his research on quantum physics, but then smoothly transitioned into discussing the coding program he had developed for underprivileged children. "We started with a simple idea," the boy explained, his voice clear and strong. "Every child deserves a chance to learn, to grow, and to be taken seriously. Nobody should be told they don't belong." Michelle felt tears welling up in her eyes as she remembered her own cruel words on the plane. Around her, the audience was captivated, many taking notes, others nodding in agreement. The presentation shifted to show statistics about their program's success. Over 200 children had now learned coding through their workshops. Several had gone on to win science competitions or secure technology internships. The Children's Hospital program was thriving, giving young patients a positive focus during their treatment. During the break, Michelle gathered her courage and approached Robert and his son. "Thank you for inviting me," she said softly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our flight." Robert smiled warmly. "I can see that. You came." "I've made some changes at my company," Michelle continued. "We've started a mentorship program for underserved youth. I've been sharing my story too, about my mistakes, my prejudices, and what I learned from them." The boy looked up at her with those same wise eyes she remembered from the plane. "That's really good," he said. "Change has to start somewhere." Other conference attendees began gathering around them. The elderly couple from the plane was there too. They had become regular volunteers at the coding workshops. The businesswoman who had sat across the aisle was now a major donor to the program. "Your story went viral, you know," Robert mentioned casually. "Someone on the plane posted about it, but instead of shaming you, we used it as a teaching moment. It's helped start important conversations about bias and assumptions." Michelle nodded. She had seen the social media posts, had read the comments. Instead of hiding from them, she had chosen to embrace the lesson and use it to help others examine their own prejudices. Back in the auditorium, the afternoon sessions focused on practical steps for creating inclusive spaces in education and technology. Michelle took detailed notes, already thinking about how to implement these ideas in her own company. During the closing remarks, Robert's son made an announcement that brought the audience to their feet. The coding program was expanding nationwide, with support from major tech companies. They were launching scholarships for underprivileged students interested in STEM fields. After the conference, at a small reception, Michelle found herself surrounded by people sharing similar stories of transformation. Some had confronted their own biases, others had overcome prejudice directed at them. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of change. "You know," Robert said, joining her with a glass of water, "that flight could have just been another ugly incident. But you chose to learn from it, to grow from it. That's what makes the difference." Michelle looked around the room, at the diverse faces, the animated conversations, the connections being made. "I was so wrong that day," she said, "but being wrong taught me how to start being right." As the evening wound down, Robert's son was surrounded by young admirers, all eager to learn about his latest research and coding projects. Michelle watched him interact with them, remembering how she had once questioned his very presence in first class. The story had come full circle. What began as a moment of prejudice had transformed into a catalyst for change. Michelle's embarrassing airplane encounter had evolved into a powerful lesson about judgment, opportunity, and the importance of seeing people for who they really are. Later that night, as Michelle drove home, she passed the airport. The sight of planes taking off into the sunset made her smile now instead of cringe. Each one carried hundreds of stories, hundreds of possibilities. She had learned that you never really know who might be sitting next to you, and that's exactly as it should be. Her phone buzzed with a message. Robert had shared her contact with some organizations interested in expanding their youth mentorship program. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to make a difference, to help create the kind of world where no child would be told they didn't belong. The shame of that flight had transformed into purpose. Sometimes, Michelle realized, our worst moments can lead to our best changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them.